There's a specific kind of silence that exists in a dead shopping centre. It's the sound of air conditioning humming over the empty tiles where thousands of people used to walk. For the last few years, if you walked into a major Australian shopping centre, past the food court, past the Kmart, past the empty unit where a department store used to be, you might have seen the ghost of a childhood memory trying to come back to life. Toys R Us. For anyone who grew up in the 90s or early noughties, that name was the cathedral of consumerism for anyone under the age of 12. A massive warehouse stacked with floor-to-ceiling shelves, Jeffrey the giraffe at the door, and enough Lego to fill a house. But in June 2025, the doors shut again. This wasn't the first time. We all remember 2018. We remember the global collapse, the liquidation sales, the empty shelves, but this time it was supposed to be different. This time they had a plan, they had new owners, and they had a digital-first strategy. They also had a shiny new flagship store in Melbourne that was supposed to revolutionize retail. And yet, less than 3 years after their grand physical return, they're gone. So what actually happened? How did a brand with that much latent goodwill, that much nostalgia, and a second chance at life managed to fail twice in less than a decade? Today, we're looking at the rise, the fall, the resurrection, and the second death of Toys R Us in Australia. We're going to look at the brutal economics of selling toys in a country with some of the highest retail rents in the world, and we're going to ask the uncomfortable question: is it actually possible to run a dedicated toy store in Australia anymore, or are we witnessing the final extinction of a retail species? Toys R Us arrived in Australia in 1993 when Australian retail was incredibly parochial. We had department stores like Myer and David Jones, and we had discount stores like Kmart and Big W, but we didn't really have category killers. A category killer is a retailer that specializes in one thing so aggressively with such massive inventory that no generalist store can compete. Bunnings is a category killer for hardware, and Officeworks is a category killer for stationery. Toys R Us was the original category killer for fun. When they opened their first stores here, it was a revelation. Suddenly, you didn't just have a choice of 3 Barbie dolls, you had an entire aisle. You didn't just see the top 10 video games, you saw all of them. And they expanded rapidly, anchoring massive bulky goods centers and prime spots in Westfields across the country. For 20 years, the model worked. It was simple volume. You lease a massive warehouse box, you fill it with high-margin plastic, and you rely on the fact that parents had very little willpower when their kids are screaming. But by 2010, the market had shifted. The internet was the obvious threat, but the more dangerous problem for Toys R Us Australia was the evolution of Kmart. Under Guy Russo's leadership in the 2010s, Kmart Australia completely reinvented itself. They stopped trying to be a mini department store and started being a volume-focused, low-price monster. They realized that toys were a perfect loss leader or low-margin traffic driver. Kmart could sell a Lego set at cost price, making zero profit just to get a mum into the store so she'd buy 5 homeware items and a t-shirt on the way out. Toys R Us couldn't do that though. They only sold toys. They needed to make margin on the toy itself. By 2017, the US parent company was drowning in debt, largely thanks to a leveraged buyout that had nothing to do with the Australian operations. But when the US ship sank, it created a whirlpool that sucked everyone else down. In 2018, Toys R Us Australia entered voluntary administration. It was a messy, emotional exit, and it was widely seen as the end of an era. But intellectual property, IP, never really dies. It just waits for a new host. In the world of private equity and retail investment, there's a theory that brand equity is worth money, even if the business attached to it is dead. Everyone knows the name Toys R Us. It has huge brand recognition, and to build that kind of recognition from scratch would cost hundreds of millions of dollars in marketing. So, buying the name is often seen as a shortcut to success. In 2019, a company called Hobby Warehouse, a smaller, local Australian operator that specialized in hobbyist gear like RC cars, model planes, and that sort of thing, bought the license for Toys R Us in Australia. Their pitch was simple. According to Chairman Kevin Moore, the comeback was based on logic rather than emotion. They argued that there was no strategic rationale in opening a network of physical stores when data predicted nearly half of all toy sales would be online by 2023. So they promised not to make the mistakes of the past. They were going to be digital first. The plan was to run Toys R Us as an e-commerce website using the famous logo to sell toys from a centralized warehouse in Victoria run by what CEO Louis Mattoni called self-learning logistics algorithms. It made sense on paper. High brand recognition, low costs, and high-tech delivery. And for a while, it seemed to work. They listed on the ASX via a reverse takeover. The share price had some buzz, and they were shipping a good number of orders. But there's a problem with being digital first when your brand is Toys R Us. The brand promise of Toys R Us is the physical experience. It's the magic. If you're just a website, you're pretty much just a worse version of Amazon. Amazon has better logistics, faster shipping, and usually lower prices. If Toys R Us wanted to compete, they realized they had to have a physical presence. They needed people to see the giraffe. But they didn't have the capital to open 40 megastores again. So they tried a middle ground, a hybrid model. In 2023, the leadership team at Toys R Us ANZ made their biggest bet. They announced the opening of a massive experiential flagship store in Clayton, Victoria. This was part of a massive purpose-built logistics facility. The vision was ambitious. A 3,200 square meter experience center attached directly to their main warehouse. They even featured a setup where customers could reportedly see state-of-the-art autonomous robots picking and packing orders in the warehouse behind the scenes. By combining the head office, the warehouse, and the flagship store into one site, they could theoretically lower their overheads and show off their supply chain technology. But in practice, this decision revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how Australians shop. First, let's look at the location. Clayton is a vital economic hub, but it's an industrial zone. It's a suburb of factories, university campuses, and logistics centers. It's not a leisure destination. Successful retail in Australia usually happens in two places: massive shopping fortresses like Chadstone or Westfield, or high-density strip malls. These are the places designed for browsing. You go there to spend half a day, eat lunch, buy clothes, and maybe even pick up a toy. Clayton is the destination you drive to for a specific purpose. Toys R Us was banking on the IKEA effect, the idea that people would drive 40 minutes to an industrial park if the store is good enough. But IKEA works because they sell furniture you can't get anywhere else, at a price you usually can't get anywhere else. Toys R Us was selling the exact same Hasbro and Mattel products available at Kmart 5 minutes down the road. The experience itself was also flawed. The company hyped the robot logistics as a major attraction. They bet that kids would be fascinated by the sight of automated shelving units moving boxes. But the novelty of watching a robot move a brown cardboard box wears off quickly. It's not a play zone, it's a fulfillment center. Once the opening weekend hype died down, the reality set in. Retail relies on consistent, boring foot traffic. It relies on the Tuesday morning mum groups and the Thursday night late night shoppers. None of those demographics hang out in industrial parks in Clayton. The store became a ghost town during the week. Worse, this facility created a massive identity crisis for the company. Were they a retailer or were they a logistics provider? It also exposed a brutal mathematical reality. By centralizing everything in this one Melbourne hub, they trapped themselves. Australia is simply too geographically vast to service cheaply from a single point. Every time they shipped a bulky dollhouse to Perth or a bike to Queensland, the freight costs ate their entire profit margin. They didn't have the network of stores that Kmart uses to keep shipping costs down, nor the volume of Amazon to negotiate better rates. They had built a state-of-the-art engine, but the fuel was costing them more than the car was worth. This was the anchor that started to drag the ship down. While the company was burning cash trying to keep this facility running, the wider Australian economy was turning against them. And that leads us to the final collapse. If you were going to pick a specific window to try and revive a discretionary retail business in Australia, the 2024 and 2025 financial year was historically difficult. By late 2024, Australian families were under immense financial pressure. Interest rates remained stubbornly high, rent was, and still is, absorbing record percentages of income, and grocery prices had risen significantly over the past 3 years. In that economic climate, the first thing to disappear from the household budget is discretionary spending. While parents will always ring-fence money for birthdays and Christmas, the impulse purchase evaporated. The casual toy bought as a reward for a good report card or a trip to the dentist became a luxury most families cut out. Toys R Us relied heavily on that casual volume, and it simply wasn't there. This scarcity of disposable income forced a change in consumer behavior that made survival almost impossible for a specialist retailer. Shoppers became ruthless about pricing, and brand loyalty was effectively replaced by price comparison. If a parent stood in a store and saw a Bluey playset for $45, they were almost certainly checking their phone. If Amazon had it for $39 with free delivery, or if Kmart was clearing it for $35, it was over. Because Toys R Us didn't have the massive scale of Amazon or the cross-category subsidization of Kmart and Target, they couldn't afford to win a price war. They were stuck selling the same product for a higher price to a customer base that had no money to spare. Compounding this revenue problem was the cost of doing business. Commercial real estate in Australia is notoriously expensive. Even though Toys R Us had fewer leases than they did in 2018, the cost of their physical footprint, including the logistics centers, continued to climb. By the middle of 2025, the company had simply run out of money. They'd been posting consistent losses, and the share price had collapsed to fractions of a cent. When management went to the market looking for a capital injection to keep the business afloat, investors just weren't interested. They looked at the balance sheet and saw a company with high operating costs, low margins, and no defensive strategy against the market giants. In June 2025, the funding dried up and the company entered voluntary administration for the second time. In most cases, a second liquidation results in the permanent dissolution of a brand. However, in July 2025, the remaining assets of Toys R Us ANZ were acquired by Directed Electronics. This was an unexpected development. Directed Electronics is an Australian distributor primarily known for automotive technology like dash cams, remote starters, and fleet telematics. They have no prior footprint in the toy industry. The logic behind the acquisition was purely digital. Directed didn't acquire the store leases or the physical infrastructure, they acquired the intellectual property, namely the domain name and the customer data. This reflects a growing trend in modern retail known as the ghost brand. The website, toysrus.com.au, remains active. Customers can still visit the URL and purchase products. However, the business is no longer a dedicated toy retailer. It's an e-commerce platform bolted onto an existing third-party logistics network. For directed electronics, the value likely lies in the customer database. By acquiring the brand, they gained access to the contact details and shopping habits of hundreds of thousands of Australian parents. In the data economy, this information is often worth more than physical inventory. However, this acquisition confirms the definitive end of the physical store network. The administrators made it clear that the brick-and-mortar operations were financially unviable. The stores have been surrendered, the signage has been removed, and the company's presence in Australian shopping centres has officially ended. The failure of Toys R Us to sustain a physical presence in Australia comes down to three specific strategic errors. First, the leadership team fundamentally misunderstood the commercial value of nostalgia. They banked heavily on the assumption that because Australians had fond memories of the brand from the 1990s, they would return as paying customers in the 2020s. However, nostalgia is a marketing hook, not a business model. It's effective at generating headlines and initial foot traffic, but it doesn't drive recurring revenue. Customers visited the new stores once to satisfy a sense of curiosity, but when the reality of 2025 pricing and product range failed to match the memory of 1998, they didn't return. The brand confused sentimental attachment with genuine market demand. Second, Toys R Us attempted to operate in the middle ground of retail, a position that has become increasingly untenable in the modern market. Successful retail is currently polarized into two extremes: extreme convenience, dominated by big players like Amazon, or extreme experience, dominated by specialist outlets like the Lego certified stores. Toys R Us was neither. Their online platform lacked the speed and efficiency of Amazon, and their physical concessions lacked the immersion of a high-end boutique. By being too expensive to compete as a discounter and too generic to compete as a premium destination, they were left with no clear value proposition. Finally, the business model failed to account for the unique challenges of Australian logistics. Australia is a massive continent with a relatively small, dispersed population, making the cost of shipping goods incredibly high. Shipping a centralized warehouse in Melbourne to customers in Perth or Queensland destroys the profit margin. Without the massive scale of Amazon or the nationwide physical footprint of Kmart to offset these costs, Toys R Us was trapped in a model where every online sale became less profitable the further away the customer lived. The departure of Toys R Us from Australian shopping centres marks a significant turning point for the industry. It suggests that the traditional big box model is facing its most difficult challenge yet. Shopping centres are evolving. Modern Aussie shops are becoming a lifestyle hub, a collection of gyms, cinemas, medical cinemas, and dining precincts. Landlords are pivoting away from leasing space to retailers who sell stuff, which can be bought online, to those who sell services, which can't. In this current ecosystem, justifying a 2,000 square meter toy store is incredibly difficult. When rent is at a premium and margins are squeezed by logistics, the math simply doesn't favor the warehouse model. Toys will, of course, still be sold. Kmart has secured the everyday volume market. Myer and David Jones continue to curate premium gifts. And for everything else, there's Amazon. But the specific experience of the Toys R Us superstore, the sheer overwhelming scale of it, is becoming a rarity. In 2025, Toys R Us didn't fail solely due to mismanagement. It struggled because it was trying to bridge a widening gap between an analog business model and a digital economic reality. It was a specialist trying to survive in a market that currently rewards generalists and discounters. Directed electronics will keep the website alive. The logo will continue to exist online, and while the physical stores are gone for now, retail is a landscape that constantly shifts. Perhaps one day, the market conditions will change enough to welcome a dedicated toy giant back. But for the foreseeable future, the aisle-wandering magic of Toys R Us is a memory rather than a destination. But what do you think? Is there still room for a dedicated toy store in Australia, or has Kmart effectively won the market? Did you visit the Clayton flagship store, or has your shopping habit shifted completely to online? Let me know in the comments section below. Anyways guys, thank you so much for watching, and as always, stay curious.